Good. Shabbat Shalom and good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to Valley Beth Shalom's Torah study. I hope that your Sidorim were very good and that you are enjoying a Pesach, albeit isolated and separated from family and friends, but a Pesach that is warm and loving. And it's nice to have back with us this morning for Torah study, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch and Rabbi Marc Gellman. Now, Marc and Sherry, we read the Haggadah, and the Haggadah tells us the story. And the commandment, the imperative of the holiday, V'higata lebincha, you will tell your child in that day the story of how we were slaves in Egypt, the story of how we were redeemed, the story of how we crossed the wilderness and entered a promised land. And we told the story on Seder night. We did it twice. We told the story with all the vividness and all of the tangible props that we could muster and all of the technique that we could in order that the story would become powerful and become a memory for all of us. That is the Bible's principal story. It's wonderful core story of Jewish identity. And the Bible's notion that God is active in history, that history is an expression of the divine will. It's a theory that was expressed, articulated by Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis, when the brothers come to him and say, we're sorry for what we did. And he says back to them, it wasn't you who did this. It was God who did this. The biblical idea of history is that history is a stage for God's actions, and we are the spectators watching this, and that the events that we perceive as human events are really a screen for the divine will acting its way out in history. And of course, when the rabbis got hold of this story, they changed it, because the rabbis experienced the destruction of Jerusalem and experienced the destruction of their civilization, with especially the death of Rabbi Akiva, which is so egregious for the rabbis, that it was impossible for them to go on seeing a God who was present in history in the same way that Joseph did, in the same way that the Seder story does. So they change it to something different. The Chacham's question in the four sons midrash in the Seder is, what are the chukim and mishpatim? What are all the laws and traditions that we're performing this Pesach? And that becomes the rabbi's idea, that God is present in history, not as a force guiding events, but God is present in history in the way that we bring mitzvot to bear upon the world. We bring God into history through mitzvah. We bring God into history through our actions. So I want to talk to you today about the narratives of the Bible, the narratives of the rabbi, the narratives of Pesach, and then the modern narratives that govern our own Jewish lives. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the core narrative that governs American Jewish life? And is it the right narrative, or are we at a moment when that narrative is changing? When that narrative is changing to something else, because we're now several generations from the Holocaust. Now, of course, next week, we're going to celebrate Yom HaShoah, and immediately after Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, these new festivals that we've added to the Jewish year, which are historical. And the question is, what's the theology of these new festivals? So let's begin with the Pesach story. The Pesach story sets out a very clear idea of how God functions in the world. And then the rabbis come in, they change that. What do you make of the Pesach story? Marc?
Well, I don't think that the story is quite as clear as you make it out. On one level, it's clear we were slaves and then we weren't slaves. That's clear. But in terms of God's relationship to the people, I think that there's a great subtlety there. And that's this, that the people really don't want to talk to God. And God understands this in time. Eventually, God gets it, that the power of God, the overwhelming force of God's presence is just too much. So when God tries to speak to the people, they say, no, hold up. We don't want to listen to you at Sinai. We'll listen to Moses. And so I think that's the narrative that emerges out of this Passover, which is the most enduring one. And that is, God realizes that God cannot enter history because it's the problem of the superhero. If there's someone who can do everything and change everything and fix everything, what purpose is there in our own action? None. We become completely passive. It's like throwing us back into Eden. So God finally gets this. God understands, I can't emancipate the slaves by taking over history. I have to let them make their own history. And I think that's the ultimate takeaway and the narrative that for 2,000 years sustains the Jewish people, which is, don't wait for God to intervene. It's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it's a miracle that you can't provoke. And I think that the ultimate consequence is that we create a religion that isolates God into the high heavens and gives us a kind of Tao, as they say in the East, a path, a way to act, a way to behave, a way to structure our lives that is an honor to God and to the teachings that God gives through Moses, the intermediary. Christians pick Jesus as the intermediary. So one of the narratives I remember learning in religious school is, oh, we Jews relate directly to God, and Christians have an intermediary. I don't think that's true at all. At all. I think all people have to have an intermediary. In Buddhism, they couldn't relate to the Buddha directly. They had to relate through the Sangha, through the community of monks. So that's the narrative that moves me, that God realizes he cannot enter history.
So Rabbi Hirsch is having some computer issues, so she's with us by telephone. We can hear the voice, even though the visage is obscured. Sherry, what's the narrative?
Well, thank you, Rabbi Feinstein, and I apologize for my technological issues, but I have to disagree with you, Rabbi Gellman, in that I don't think God is sitting there thinking, oh, they're not going to believe me anymore. We've got to shift the narrative to them. I think you're giving God too much credit. I think God in the Bible is very much arrogant and wants everyone to worship him, her, whatever you describe God as. But I think the rabbis changed the narrative because they want some real participation in this story, because they feel far too distant from this God. And maybe you said that to some degree, but I don't think God's directing that. I think humans are directing that. I think the narrative is, please, we have to be a part of the story because you running the show, we're not feeling so comfortable. And the best example of that is God says to Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now go and ask him to release the Israelites. And any clear-thinking human being, like I imagine Moses to be, would be like, really? What's this stupid exercise you're forcing me to do? So I think the rabbis recognize that humans are questioning God, and they want to give us more responsibility and more participation, which is what I think we all want in our lives, is to feel that our actions truly matter.
So there's an issue here between whether the story is God-centered or whether the story is human-centered. Is that how you read it,
Correct.
Sherry?
That's exactly how I read it. And I don't think we're giving God too much credit. I think we really are. And I really am trying to log back in so I can see the two of you and you can see me. So forgive me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. The story, I think, is quite remarkable. I read it. I think the midrash that you read in the Haggadah that says, not by a seraph, not by an angel, not by a messenger, but God Himself is the one who redeemed us. So I think for the biblical story, it's a very God-centered story, and human beings are really sort of bystanders in this. When the rabbis get hold of it, that's when it becomes a more human story, because the rabbis had this issue. They didn't live in the same world that the Bible lived in. They expected miracles, and the miracles didn't come. The temple got destroyed. And when the temple got destroyed, it became very clear to them that they needed a different way to interpret the presence of God in history.
Yeah, to me, I agree that the rabbis changed it, but I would still stick with my theory that everyone needs an intermediary between themselves and God, that God is simply too powerful, too abstract, too distant in Aristotle's sense, thought thinking.
Gellman,
But
no.
the idea, the way the rabbis changed it, in my view, is that they got Moses out of the story. It's not a coincidence. It's a bizarre fact that Moses doesn't appear in the story of Moses taking the people out of Egypt in the Haggadah. Moses isn't even in the story. So it's obvious the rabbis hated Moses, and there are many midrashim that support that. They were worried the people would worship Moses. So what they did, as they replaced the law, they replaced Moses with the law. And now the intermediary between the people and God is the law, which, by the way, they administered and they interpreted. So it put them back in the center of Jewish life.
I have to say, I think you're giving Moses and God way too much credit. I think the rabbis want us in the story, and that biblical God is just too hard to believe in. And what you said, Rabbi Feinstein, I think is absolutely correct. There's a human-centered story and there's a God-centered story. And we're humans and we need the human-centered story. We need it because the God story is just too distant and too far off. And especially in this moment when people are really questioning God or trying not to question God every single moment.
Okay.
What is the human part of the Exodus? I don't see that at all. It's all about God doing this stuff. The miracle is
Right.
God originated. Where do you see human participation in the Exodus?
That's the narrative of the biblical story. Why I'm saying the Haggadah takes on a whole different narrative is because the rabbis want us to move away from that biblical God and into a very personal relationship with God and each other. And it's a much more intimate story to get us literally connected to a God that doesn't need an intermediary. To get us truly connected.
Of that, I don't see that at all.
So let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you both, and because I want to move to the next level of our conversation. So
Okay.
next week, the Jewish world will, as it were, celebrate 2.5 holidays. There she is. One of the holidays will be Yom HaShoah, the day that we commemorate Holocaust, and it's actually Yom HaShoah Ugvura. It was the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the second of those days will be Yom HaAtzmaut, preceded by Yom HaZikaron. And the rabbis of the community, even within the Orthodox world, except for the very Haredi world, are going to recite Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, which is to say that Yom HaAtzmaut is a day of miracles. So we're seeing, once again, in modernity, a recovery of the notion of a God of history. Okay? Can we believe in a God of history? Or does the Shoah shut that down completely?
Well, of course you can believe in a God of history, but what does God do in history? What God does in history is God tells us the way history works and puts us into history to decide with our own free will whether we will choose life or choose death, whether we will choose to stop the rise of European fascism, which led to the Holocaust, or whether we will choose to ignore the rise of European fascism and allow the Holocaust. To me, it's very, very clear. God has created history as the domain for human free will and choice. And therefore, the theological problem of the Holocaust for me has never existed. I never expected God to stop the Holocaust any more than I expected God to establish the state of Israel as compensation for the Holocaust. Both those ideas, for me, are theologically naive and, in fact, dangerous because they take away the responsibility of human action. Israel was created by people who never gave up, and the Holocaust was provoked by people who did give up.
So Rav Kook, the first great chief rabbi in the beginning of the 20th century, saw in the chalutzim, even in the secular chalutzim, the building, the coming of a redemption, the beginning of a process. And it was his son who, on the eve of the Six-Day War, who predicted that this would be a recovery of a sense of God's presence in history. And then after the Six-Day War, we recited a new bracha. We said in the Birkat Hamazon, we said, Harachaman hu yivarech et Medinat Yisrael, bless the state of Israel, Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the first flowerings of our redemption. Even Abraham Heschel wrote in his book Echoes of Eternity that he saw the presence of God, he saw the hand of God in the history of the Jewish people in the Six-Day War. And certainly lots of people today see the miracles of Israel as a miracle of God. And it leads you into this problem of there's a God in history that can create a state of Israel. Then how do you understand a God involved in the Holocaust? And if you take God out of history the way you do, Gellman, then can you still see the state of Israel as an expression of divine will in the world? And it's a sort of interesting trap that next week comes to fruition. That trap is sprung next week when the two holidays fall within a few days of each other.
But that's only a problem if you imagine God to be Superman. If you don't imagine God to be Superman, but rather as the supreme teacher of the way, the supreme force of life and goodness, then what you say is, look, God gave you a choice, and Israel is an example of God's will in the world, only in this regard. Israel is a country, a democracy that supports the salvation of the Jewish people in a broken and wounded world. And that's what God wants. But it isn't that God did it, it's that God wants that. And we do it. Any other vision of God leads to what my teacher Richard Rubinstein experienced in his book After Auschwitz. He became filled with despair and became an atheist. But the solution is to have a real, viable idea of God, not a child's idea of God, not a Marvel Comics or DC Comics idea of God, that God will swoop in and save us. That idea of God is bound to disappoint and bound to alienate people from faith.
I don't want to set it up so binary. I think God, as we're talking about Gellman in this moment, is outside of human beings. But what if God is within human beings, and that spark of divinity is God acting in the world as human beings are acting? So the development of Israel, the conquering of nations, the accomplishments, the sadness, all that is part and parcel of God's will. And so it's not that the Holocaust was God's will, but human beings are in partnership with God. And sometimes they use that free will for good, and sometimes they don't.
Yes, that's what I said.
Sorry. Forgive me. I don't have the same visual that I normally do. Not
as
the visual as audio.
As Oscar Wilde said once, ma'am, you have not had the pleasure of understanding me.
That may be true.
I agree completely, Sherry. That's exactly what I think God's relationship is to us. God lays down the laws of freedom, and we enact freedom or don't in the world, and we bear its consequences.
So do you believe that, I was going to say, but do you believe when we're more connected to God that we have a better ability to enact the goodness in the world? Or
yes, of course, because we're choosing life. We're choosing freedom. We're choosing everything that the Torah teaches us we should choose. That's it.
Sherry, help me understand what it means to have a personal relationship with God. If God is not involved in the outcome of events, if God is not the guarantor of redemption in some way, as God is in the Exodus story, but we pull God out of history to an extent, So then how do you understand a personal God? When someone says to you, I'm hurting, can you help me pray? How do you understand that request? How do you answer that request?
So I love that you asked that, Rabbi Feinstein, because I think every single human being needs a personal relationship with God. And how you understand God is very different, right? As we know, there's 88 names for God in the Bible. That's about a fifth of all the words. There's only 500 words used over and over again. My issue is, how do you create that personal connection? Because everybody needs to feel deeply connected with something greater than themselves. They really do. And I see it when I worked as a chaplain at Cedars-Sinai many years ago. This is completely anecdotal, but there's been studies done on it. I would walk in and talk to people, and the people that had a God concept or a feeling of connection to something greater than themselves literally walked through those illnesses with a different sense of purpose, a different sense of comfort, a different sense of meaning. And I think that people that don't, it's a much harder life. And, you know, pain is real, suffering is optional, right? Pain happens to all of us, but how we deal with that, how we respond to that, and how we lean on God through that, that is something that I think can change the way we think and feel.
When I wrote the book about Rabbi Schulweis, shameless plug, I
that
came
wasn't
to
shameless. That's a great book.
It is a great book.
But I came to the conclusion, having studied his life now, I've been living with him for many, many years and studied his life, that everyone credits Harold Schulweis with his innovations, with introducing chavurot in synagogues and helping to create mazon and various other great innovations in American Jewish life. But I came to the conclusion at the end of my study that the real genius that he possessed was a genius on a level prior to innovation. He was able to grasp the narratives that animated American Jewish life. And when he saw that those narratives were flawed, he would step in and try to create new narratives, to correct the narratives. The most famous example is when he saw, as your teacher Richard Rubinstein published, that Jews were falling into a terrible sense of despair because the God that they read in the Haggadah doesn't show up to save them in the Holocaust. And rather than allow people to fall into the kind of terrible despair that Rubinstein describes, a dark and meaningless world, he tried to correct the Holocaust narrative by introducing the idea of revering those Christian rescuers who came to aid Jews. Now, this was a tremendous revolution in the way that people thought about the Shoah, because you suddenly saw, number one, that all the bad guys, all the non-Jews were not bad guys, that there were actually Christians, heroes, who and priests and ministers and ordinary people, workers of all kinds who rescued Jews. And he changed the narrative in order to embrace moral heroism in the course of the Shoah. And in that way, that's where he identified the presence of God in that horrible moment. A lot of people resisted this because they said that he trivialized the horror and emphasized what was a small theme. And it was only after Steven Spielberg made his movie about Schindler that people began to really resonate with Harold's retelling of the Holocaust narrative. But in American Jewish life as well, he found narratives that he felt were wrong. Harold never believed, for example, that the narrative of the vanishing American Jew was true. He never believed that there was an inevitability to assimilation for American Jews. He just believed that American Jews were abandoning Judaism because Judaism didn't offer an answer to their deepest religious yearnings and questions. And if that we could offer an answer, then instead of abandoning Jewish life, people would embrace Jewish life. So I want to ask you this question. What is the governing narrative of American Jewish life at this moment? And what should it be? And where is it going? And how is it evolving? Sherry, you want to take a crack at this?
Sure. I actually think the narrative, no question, that's governing Jewish life right now is Tikkun Olam is Judaism. And if you are doing social action, you are doing Jewish. And I think it is, I believe in social action. I don't want anyone to say after this Torah study, Rabbi Hirsch is anti-social action, but that cannot be the governing narrative of an entire 5,000-year-old tradition. There has to be so much more. There's also all these sub-narratives, Rabbi Feinstein, like the institutions are dead and synagogue life doesn't matter. And, you know, I can name them all, but I think what's more interesting is how we reframe our narrative. What if we said Jewish life is incredibly thriving? It just looks utterly different than 16th century, 18th century Jewry. What if we reframed it in a way that we understood it differently? I don't think social action can be the only narrative. I think there's just far too many at the moment that we're missing out on. It's too limiting for Judaism.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's the Tikkun Olam is a pathetic replacement for real Judaism. But I also think real Judaism provides a narrative that doesn't have to be adjusted. And our abandonment of this narrative is the central cause for our weakness. And that is the narrative that death is not the end of us, that there is a life after death. This is what provides people with hope, that we are destined for another world. And when you talked about the people that you counseled who were dying, I had the same anecdotal experience. But being with the priest all those years, I also saw it in an additional dimension, and that was that Christians, to say this in the most blunt way possible, Christians seem to me, in my experience, to die better than Jews die. And that was because they believed their souls were going to heaven. Jews don't believe that. And the reason they don't believe that is they haven't been taught that. It isn't that Judaism doesn't teach it. Judaism does teach it. And it isn't that it isn't important. It's fundamentally important. It's the way we have a personal relationship with God, which is that in this world, our free will determines what happens to us. But this world is not the only world. There is another world where our soul will enter and we will be reconnected with those who have died before us and with the mysteries of God that have eluded us in this life. That is what people need to hear. That is what no rabbis that I know of preach about regularly. And that is why there seems to be a much greater sense of acceptance of death by those who don't believe that the grave is the end, but who believe that this is another stage on the journey. And that, I believe, is the narrative that will save us in the future. The belief in Olam Haba, the world to come.
So what happened, Marc? We Jews embraced the Enlightenment,
yes,
because it gave us freedom. But in embracing the Enlightenment, we let the Enlightenment sweep away elements of our own theology that
yes,
you maintain are critical to maintaining a sense of who we are in the world. And that we're coming now to a point.
It was Hegel. We believed in reason and rationality and everything that contradicted something you could prove or touch was rejected out of hand. And in fact, in the early Reform Sidurim, they rejected the idea of Mechaya Meitim. They rejected it all. And they rejected the idea that there is another world. That's exactly what we did. We bought into the Enlightenment and to the rationalistic legacy of the Enlightenment. And if you look at who's thriving in the world, what religious traditions are thriving, it is the evangelicals and others who say, listen, God does have a relationship with you, but that relationship isn't going to give you a job if you don't have a job. I mean, there's preachers who do that, but they're morons. It's that this God is going to take your soul into heaven at the end of your life and reunite you with those whom you loved more than life itself. That's what I believe. And that's what Judaism believes. And
Gellman.
otherwise, you go to synagogue and you hear book reviews, you hear movie reviews, you hear tikkun olam statements. And who needs that? Who gets inspired by that? Nobody I know. Nobody. Except operatives in some political party. We have to go back to being a faith that teaches hope, that survives death. Plato thought that was the purpose of philosophy. And in fact, it is to reduce the fear of death. And that's what religion does. It reduces the fear of death. And we aren't doing that. And because of that, people leave still hungry, even after we feed them.
That is one theological narrative, and I agree with it. And I would say there's other narratives for our peoplehood, which is, I think those movie clubs and book clubs are really important. I think community as a narrative to combat loneliness and disconnection is a powerful Jewish story, and that we're the people that do community well and understand community and know how to really care for the ill and take care of the mourner and to be there for other people. I mean, look at what Jews are teaching the world right now and how to deal with isolation. So I think a theological narrative, powerful, and I agree with it, but I don't think it touches every Jew out there. I think there's a behavioral narrative. I think there is a connection narrative. I even would go so far that there's a missionary narrative. We've always said, we're not missionary. We should spread the word. I don't think we should forcibly make people convert, but our wisdom is wise, and I think we should share it with the world. I think that narrative that we should be unabashed in sharing Judaism is a narrative that is very compelling and would turn a lot of people on. So my fear is that we reduce Judaism to one narrative, and I don't think there's one that will solve it. I think what's so embracing about our way of life is that there are so many narratives within it, truly. So many. And that's why I have to just bring it back to Passover. That's why I loved this holiday, because we get to retell the story through the new lens of our lives each year. And when we retell it, it's a different story. And in the telling is where we actually make it okay in our life, right? It's not the story, whether it's the retelling of how we survived, how we overcame, how we were resilient. It's the retelling that makes the narrative really compelling. I could go on this for a long time because I feel very strongly that the multiplicity of narratives is one of the key to survival of the Jewish people.
Well, but there's some narratives that don't work, Sherry. I came from New York, and you studied in New York, and you know the narrative of the secular Jew of New York, which is, I'm part of the Jewish people. I like lox and bagels. I like Jewish food, and I like the Jewish people. I like other Jews. That's dead after a generation. They spoke Yiddish. They had a Yiddish theater. They had a complete Ashkenazi culinary obsession. And all of that looked like a narrative. It looked great. It was the Jewish people of New York, for example. A lot of them were secular Jews, and they believed in Yiddishkeit. They didn't believe, which is Jewishness. They didn't believe in Judaism, but it is only Judaism that is an effective Judaizing force. Yiddishkeit isn't, and this isn't a binary choice, Sherry. I live across from a church here in Westlake Village, and this community of this Catholic church, St. Jude, formed around the belief that they're going to heaven, also has community. It also has communities of people that overcome loneliness. The idea of it's either book groups or believing in life after death is wrong. You can walk and chew gum. These are two different things. A community has to be formed around belief. And if it isn't formed around belief, then it's not going to survive. And the only belief that sustains us, the only one people worry about, is the belief that death is not the end of us.
Rabbi Feinstein, I question the actions of what you just said, Rabbi Gellman, is that the only communities formed around belief are the ones that survive. And I would beg to differ. There are many from communities that belief is not secondary, it's not tertiary, it is around behavior, and they survive very well because the behavior is what drives it.
They don't. How many Jews speak Yiddish? How many Jews speak? No one speaks Yiddish anymore. And that was a community formed around Yiddish, formed around the culture of Yiddish. And it's gone. It's over.
No. In Netflix right now, Unorthodox, there's an entire series in Yiddish. You cannot say that it's gone when it is an entire series in Yiddish, done by Deborah Spellman's book.
So I want to take a position between the two of you, because I don't think you disagree as vehemently as you think you do. I appreciate Rabbi Gellman's position. I think that you overstate the case about afterlife, but I believe that your notion of a belief system at the core of an identity is very, very important. And Sherry, I don't disagree with you that behavioral patterns make a community and sustain life with a sense of meaning. But I think underneath those behavioral patterns are statements of belief, whether they're implicit or explicit. Sometimes they're just implicit. They're not actually stated, but a sense that my behavior matters, the sense that the universe bears a certain, that my behavior has an echo in a universe beyond my own satisfactions, and that I'm responsible for something beyond my own satisfactions. These are belief systems that are implicit in the behavioral communities that you're referring to. Now Marc's idea that afterlife is the key to this, we can debate that. But I believe that a theology, a sense of how the universe works and where I fit in it, is key to a sense of meaning and to a sense of sustaining a community over time, because that community bears, you're fighting for a truth. You're fighting for a truth that matters. And one of the mistakes we made in the last generation is thinking that you can create a Jewish identity which isn't a truth. It's simply either a pattern of affiliation or a pattern of somehow a pattern of behavior without it being founded on a truth. Maimonides, for Maimonides, being a Jew meant holding a truth. For our ancestors, the Seder is all about a truth. And the question that we need to ask is, like what Rabbi Gellman suggests, it's afterlife. What are the tenets of truth which we're prepared to offer our children and tell them this is what you need to believe in to live a life of meaning and purpose in the course of your existence? Well, I want to thank both of you today. This was a great discussion. I want to wish both of you a good Shabbos and a wonderful Chol Hamoed Pesach. I hope that Pesach is sustaining you as you have helped us sustain our Pesach. And I hope we can see each other next Shabbos and over the course of the week. For friends at Valley Beth Shalom, Havdalah this evening at 8:15. And during the course of the week, we have the ending days of Pesach on Wednesday and Thursday. On Wednesday, the seventh day, services at 10 in the morning. On Thursday, the Shabbat, the Yontif service begins at 10, and at roughly 10:45, we'll have the Yizkor prayers. And if you'd like to say Yizkor, join us online. You can find the link at vbs.org and click on the Passover logo. To both of you and to your families, stay safe and stay warm and stay well. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom.
Sameach, my friend.
Chag Sameach.